Welcome to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. Americans gathering across the country to memorialize George Floyd, the unarmed black man who died in the hands of police. That sparked nationwide protests. These protests now going on for the 9th day in a row, the latest protests being largely peaceful. Some cities, including my own, along with Washington, D.C. and L.A., are lifting their curfews tonight. Meantime, we are awaiting what is likely going to be another very dismal jobs report. Tomorrow, unemployment expected to soar to almost 20%. Markets slumping today. I want to bring in Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle. Abigail, they finally broke their streak. This as things actually calm down on the protest front. Walk us through the ups and downs today.
So it was a bit of a volatile day, even though the moves were relatively small. As for the move down, breaking that 4-day winning streak, at least for the S&P 500, the NASDAQ, I think, Emily, it actually had to do with the virus. The Florida virus numbers, COVID-19 numbers, came out around 11 a.m., and they were a little bit higher than the 7-day average. And right after that, we saw a pretty sharp leg lower. The S&P 500 never really recovering. Tech hit even worse. And what makes it so interesting, that NASDAQ 100 yesterday, as you know, had flirted with a record closing high. Early today, the NASDAQ had been above that level, but not able to close there. So close and yet so far. This on stay-at-home weakness, the FANG stocks, the biotechs, really weak. So we're seeing that rotation into the cyclicals, but it's hurting these mega cap tech stocks. The big question is, Emily, because these stocks are such a big weighting to the major averages, is there more pain ahead, especially after such a big run-up? The sense that stocks shouldn't be so high and actually overextended conditions, quite frankly.
Meantime, there's still a lot of uncertainty ahead. You've got Slack just reporting its results, withdrawing its full-year guidance. And Slack, of course, is a company that, we've considered a pandemic winner because so many people are slacking as they work from home. ZoomInfo also going public and spiking. Make sense of that.
So Slack is really pretty interesting. Last time I looked in the after hours, down about 20%, withdrawing that billings guidance, which is really not a great thing, and suggesting that the initial surge maybe isn't going to come through. That will create uncertainty, you're right, for all of these stay-at-home stocks. On the other hand, look at ZoomInfo Technologies. Unbelievable. Its first day of trading in this environment, up 62%, at the highs, up 90%, more than 90%. It causes you to wonder whether or not the bankers really mispriced this one, or is there so much FOMO out there, so much fear of missing out, driven by the liquidity from the Fed, that investors want all in? Now, of course, when I think about IPOs, I think about Facebook back in 2012, May of 2012, and it was bungled, some say. You can see that first year of trading for Facebook, their first year as a public company, not so great, down 38%, some growing pains. It's going to be interesting to see whether or not ZoomInfo can hang on to those first day gains, or if growing pains as a publicly traded company are ahead, as is true not just for Facebook, but so many of the other social media companies as well, Emily.
Abigail, I remember that day well, camped out on Facebook's campus the day of the IPO. Nobody expected it to go that way that day, but it's certainly been a different story since. Okay, Abigail Doolittle for us in New York. Meantime, talking about Facebook, the social network, saying it will start blocking ads from state-run media outlets to minimize the impact of potential foreign interference in the U.S. election. I want to bring in Bloomberg's Kurt Wagner, who covers Facebook for us. And Facebook has been taking smaller steps towards this. Kurt, how significant is it now that they're saying they will actually block state-run media outlet advertising?
I don't know if it's going to be as significant in the United States as elsewhere because the U.S. doesn't really have state-sponsored media that is, making a lot of noise here. But obviously, this is a big deal that came about after the 2016 election and then the years after that, where we saw, posts by organizations like Russia Today or Sputnik, and those would kind of go viral on the service without people necessarily realizing that those in particularly were Russian state-sponsored news agencies. So the company has been trying to label these and make sure that when people see them in their feed, they're aware of where they're coming from, and to avoid even any potential issues. They're just going to cut ads from the organizations in the U.S. altogether.
Meantime, Kurt, the debate over Mark Zuckerberg's position on the president's post about looters and shooters, leaving that up, you now have Facebook employees, several dozen of them, signing an open letter to CEO Mark Zuckerberg. A portion of that letter I want to read here. We grew up at Facebook, but it is no longer ours. Facebook claims that providing warnings about a politician's speech is inappropriate, but removing content from citizens is acceptable, even if both are saying the same thing. That is not a noble stand for freedom. It is incoherent, and worse, it is cowardly. Fact-checking is not censorship. Labeling a call to violence is not authoritarianism. Please reconsider your position. What is your take on this? Obviously, we have seen Facebook employees themselves protesting publicly, and now these are quite strong words from former Facebook employees.
You know, I had that line about cowardly highlighted on my end as well. I thought this letter was pretty strongly worded, and really this whole week has been a surprise to me only because we've seen Facebook in hot water a lot of times over the years. Never have we seen employees and now former employees really come out in a public way specifically against Mark Zuckerberg like this. I've been surprised. I mean, I knew the decision, of course, was going to be unpopular for a lot of people, but I think that this is a significant moment here. He has been challenged the way he hasn't been before. I don't necessarily expect him to change, but I do think that for one of the first times is kind of stand.
Is there anything, Kurt, in your reporting that indicates that Mark Zuckerberg is at all reconsidering or rediscussing his position internally?
No, in fact, the opposite. There was an employee all-hands meeting on Tuesday where he took questions from employees that took 90 minutes, and he actually reiterated that he kind of he doubled down, I should say, on his decision to leave these posts up. And I think that, you know, between Friday and Tuesday, he had a lot of time to think about that. There had already been an employee walkout that you had mentioned. And so if he was going to change his mind, I think by Tuesday when he addressed the staff, that probably would have been the right time. So my guess and my understanding from everyone I've spoken to is that this decision is made and it's probably not changing.
All right, Bloomberg's Kurt Wagner for us. We're going to continue to watch your reporting on this, Kurt. Thank you so much for calling in today. All right, coming up, going public in the midst of a pandemic. ZoomInfo shares soared today, doubling in the company's debut after a $935 million initial public offering. Our conversation with CEO Henry Schuck is next. This is Bloomberg. ZoomInfo, the business intelligence platform, soared in its U.S. public debut, raising $935 million in an IPO today that priced above the targeted range. Earlier today, ZoomInfo and Discover.org founder and CEO Henry Schuck spoke to Bloomberg Television. Take a listen.
I honestly, thank you for having me. I have not looked at the stock trading today.
Oh, come on.
I've been focused. Look, we're building a company here for the long term. And I have the same company today as I had yesterday. And what the stock does today and what it does this week, you know, is what it will do. But I'm focused on building long-term value for our shareholders. I founded this company when I was 23 years old. I put $25,000 on my credit card while I was in law school, and I set out to build a business that could help sales and marketing professionals selling to other businesses hit their number. And I'm just as focused on that today as I was yesterday when we weren't a public company.
All right, so there's been obviously a lot of focus on the IPO itself, of course, of the naming of your company and how it might conflict with the names of some other companies. Talk a little bit specifically, though, about your business and specifically what the customer environment is like for you, given that some businesses now have either curtailed spending or at least maybe put off plans to increase spending.
Yeah, interestingly, look, what ZoomInfo does is it helps business-to-business companies find their next customer. And in a pre-COVID environment, that was important. In a post-COVID environment, that's just as important. And companies are looking for ways to digitize their sales efforts. A lot of companies have had enterprise sales reps who are all out in the field, come in-house or come to work from home situations. And how do you make those sellers productive? How do you make them effective and efficient? You do it with data, and you do it with insights, and you do it with technology. And that's what ZoomInfo provides our customers, over 15,000 companies and 200,000 sales and marketing professionals across the globe.
So how do you continue to grow? How do you use obviously the billion close to that you raised in the IPO is buying back debt, is returning cash to initial investors, but where do you put money to work now?
Yeah, so first, we sit in the middle of a really large total addressable market. It's a $24 billion total addressable market. We serve 700,000 businesses who sell to other businesses. And so first, we're 2% penetrated in that market, so we have a really large opportunity to continue to acquire customers, and we've built an incredibly efficient go-to-market engine to do just that. And so whether you're a Fortune 100 company like SAP or Sodexo, or you're a small pallet manufacturer in Alabama, if you sell to another business, we have a solution that can help you find your next customer more effectively, more efficiently. And that's as important today, or in fact, more important today in the pandemic environment.
That was Henry Schuck, the CEO of ZoomInfo there. Joining us now to discuss the outlook for IPOs for the rest of the year in the middle of this pandemic is Jeff Thomas, NASDAQ's head of West Coast listings. Jeff, so good to have you back here on the show. We had ZoomInfo shooting up today, Warner Music also spiking yesterday. Is this pent-up demand? Is this low pricing? Why are we seeing such optimism about these companies?
Well, both of those companies have been on file since March and had to put their plans on hold. So these were companies that did a great job staying in touch with investors, educating them on their story, and making sure they understood the value that they brought when they came to market today.
So talk to us about then what this means for the pipeline. I mean, surely there are other companies considering going out of the gate. They're seeing this. They're gaining confidence, despite the fact that we are in the middle of a health crisis, an economic crisis, and a social crisis. What do these spikes signal to the rest of the market?
Well, one of the things that's going to be part of the new norm is companies now have to execute their roadshow virtually. They have to get to know and interact with investors over video calls instead of in-person roadshows. So that's going to be a part of the playbook at least through the end of the year, and maybe permanently. So that creates a greater emphasis for companies to get engaged with institutional investors earlier in their life cycle. And as we see more public investors investing in private companies, that's part of what helps these great tech companies come to market.
It's also impacted your own operations, and I know NASDAQ has historically relied less on humans than the New York Stock Exchange, but how has the pandemic, the social distancing, the sheltering in place impact how you do business and get new business?
Well, we're not able to celebrate with companies like ZoomInfo at MarketSite for an in-person bell ceremony. Everything else about our process and our procedure and market operations has stayed exactly the same through the pandemic. We've now brought 17 companies public through the exact same process that we used before the pandemic because we've pioneered the electronic markets. Everything is operating exactly as it always has.
Now, there are some sectors that have seen some interesting volatility. Of course, biotech, with so many different companies working on vaccine candidates. Good news, bad news, confusing news. What are you looking for in the biotech sector specifically?
Well, healthcare has definitely been one of the areas where we've seen the highest number of new offerings throughout the pandemic. As you mentioned, lots of companies working on advancements, both around the coronavirus, as well as on other great therapies and therapeutics that can help to keep us all healthier. So we expect to see a strong pipeline through the fall. Of course, many companies will need to get their IPOs done within September or October ahead of the election, where of course we'll see more volatility and potentially some slowness in the IPO market.
Meantime, there have been companies that were planning to go public this year, like Airbnb, whose business has, been completely disrupted by this pandemic. We're not expecting Airbnb to go public this year now, but do you expect, because of these delays, how many more delays or how long does the delay last, given the continued uncertainty ahead?
Well, lots of private companies have had to make very tough decisions, especially those whose businesses have been impacted. There's been a high number of layoffs in tech startups this year, and we've seen a lot of more aggressive terms in fundraising rounds. However, those companies who are on the right side with business actually picking up through the pandemic, companies that enable employees to work from home, those in cybersecurity, we actually see those companies starting to pick up and have an easier time raising capital. And even some private companies now starting to provide liquidity to their shareholders. Where we saw the secondary market cool off with the start of the pandemic, we've now started to see activity on NASDAQ private market pick up.
Now, we were speaking with an analyst earlier this week who suggested that somewhere between now and October, just ahead of the U.S. election, is going to be kind of a sweet spot for these companies that are looking to get out of the gate, who may have been delayed from earlier this year. Are you expecting to see that as well? I mean, over the next 3 months, 4 months, do you expect a spike in activity?
Yeah, we expect to have a very busy June and July. Historically, August has been very slow, but we actually might see some activity then. There is usually a lull right around before the Labor Day holiday. And then I think through September and October, it'll continue to be busy. So I think we're in for a busy couple of months.
So then what about next year? I mean, there certainly will be a new normal when we come out of this, if we come out of this. And how are you changing your business operations and your expectations to adjust to that?
Well, one of the big changes is that companies now have to connect with investors in a new way. So across our investor relations franchise, we're now helping companies connect through investors through video, phone calls, and even our own investor conferences we're operating virtually. The second big impact and the big change, as you mentioned, some of all the major economic and changes in the world today, is a shift from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. So we've been investing heavily in services and offerings to help companies report their environmental, social, and governance disclosures along with their financial disclosures.
All right. Well, certainly we're going to be looking to you for updates as the year continues, and good to see some good news, at least for a couple of companies out of the gate this week. Jeff Thomas, NASDAQ's head of West Coast listings. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Emily.
All right. Coming up, Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, speaking out about the death of George Floyd and the protests that have been happening across the country. We'll hear more of what Cook had to say next. This is Bloomberg. Apple CEO Tim Cook is calling on his company to do more to fight racial inequality. In a memo to employees, an open letter published on Apple's website saying, to create change, we have to re-examine our own views and actions in light of a pain that is deeply felt but too often ignored. Issues of human dignity will not abide standing on the sidelines. To the Black community, we see you. You matter and your lives matter. I want to bring in Mark Gurman, who, of course, covers Apple and consumer technology for us. Mark, expand a little bit on what Tim Cook had to say here. He has increasingly, over the years, become a louder voice on some of these social issues that his predecessor, Steve Jobs, never talked about in public. Talk to us more about what Tim Cook had to say.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Emily. So he has been pretty open, pushing for equality for all, not only at Apple, but, in the United States and globally. He's made lots of donations and speeches on these causes. And it's really started right as the protests and riots were really sparking in the United States after the murder of George Floyd. He sent a memo to all Apple employees on Saturday, which we published over the weekend. And then the message posted on apple.com today is basically that same memo being republished. And his point basically is that he's seen these types of incidents like we saw with George Floyd in America for the last, several decades. And, the difficult part for a lot of people to swallow is that nothing has really changed. We've seen this type of situation in America for far too long. And that's really his point, that he's standing there with the Black and brown communities, as he said, not only at Apple, but external as well.
Tim Cook, who, of course, was raised in Alabama. Increasingly, we're hearing these statements from CEOs, these commitments, and we're looking to business leaders, perhaps more than ever, and not as much to politicians, to be the force of reason here. But how do we hold them accountable to these commitments, to these statements that they're making?
I mean, I could really only speak for what we've seen in the past. Typically, when Cook does say that Apple would be donating or doing something in terms of social issues, at least specifically, the company typically does follow through with it. They're offering 2-for-1 employee matches on charitable donations for the month of June. He said they're making donations to the Equal Justice Initiative, and he says that challenges racial injustice and mass incarceration. So, I have no reason to believe that they're not going to go through with it. This seems to be something that is very important to Cook and others at Apple, well aside from their products. And so this is clearly a very, important issue to them.
Meantime, Mark, you are always covering what's happening in the supply chain, what's happening with demand. We had Gartner coming out earlier this week saying they're expecting a 20% drop in smartphones this year. What does that mean for Apple?
Yeah, right now, obviously, consumer demand is really rough. We've seen so many different things going on in the world right now, obviously, coronavirus being top of mind. And typically, that is going to force a little bit of slowdown in sales. But I think the company's optimistic things will ramp back up toward the very tail end of the year and into 21.
Apple has closed some stores due to the protests. Can you give us the latest on that?
Yeah, and I think it's actually interesting as well that, Apple has not really commented publicly, going against the protests in terms of the looting specifically, right? I mean, if you've seen the videos online and Twitter, some Apple stores have been hit pretty hard in terms of looting. Now, this really started right as Apple was ramping up the reopenings of the United States, and they were at the point where they had already reopened half of the stores in the U.S., about 135 stores. So they've closed the majority of them. They closed the majority of them on Sunday, and they've gradually started reopening them again. There are still a number of stores that are closed today, but my belief is after this weekend, when there's a few more protests scheduled in different parts of the country, you'll start seeing them back up to that about 135 number they were at prior to last weekend.
Interesting. Of course, we'll be watching what happens Friday and through the weekend, as will you, Mark Gurman. Thank you so much for that update. Coming up, FCC Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel weighs in on President Trump's executive order aimed at curbing the power of social media. That conversation next. Welcome back to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. The executive order by President Trump aimed at social media companies has widened the partisan divide within the Federal Communications Commission. This posing challenges for the commission trying to determine how to respond to the president's demand. FCC Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel has said President Trump is trying to turn the FCC into his personal speech police. She joined us earlier today.
Section 230 has been around for decades, and it's really important for online speech. It protects all sorts of online expression, but this executive order asks the FCC to make rules for Section 230 so that the agency would give a green light or a red light for what kind of speech can go online and what should be taken down. I don't think that's right.
The FCC hasn't taken any action on this yet. Do you think they will?
Well, according to the executive order, the Department of Commerce is going to file a petition with the FCC asking us to take action sometime before the end of July.
So is that an appropriate role for the FCC? I mean, if Chairman Pai, who controls the agenda, was here with us, what would you recommend to him?
I don't think the Federal Communications Commission should be the president's speech police. I think we've got a First Amendment and we need to honor it.
That said, Section 230 is, as you mentioned, a decades-old law, came about before Google existed, when Mark Zuckerberg was a boy. I mean, do you think that Section 230 can really remain and should remain untouched?
Absolutely. It's been around for a while. It's important for expression online. But here's what I know. It's up to Congress to write the laws. The president can't issue a new law through executive order or ask an agency like mine to rewrite the law. That's up for Congress. It's Congress's job.
Facebook and Twitter have taken very different approaches to speech on their platforms. Your FCC colleague, Brendan Carr, has said that Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey is weaponizing the platform in favor of his own partisan political beliefs. What's your reaction to that?
I feel like so much of Washington has this exactly backwards. The First Amendment is there to protect social media from the president. It's not there to protect the president from social media.
So do you think that Twitter and Facebook have lived up to their responsibilities? I mean, they've taken very different approaches to speech and to specifically the president's speech, and a post in question where the president suggested that looters be shot.
Listen, social media is frustrating, and we all know that because we all look for information there every day. We also see misinformation. But I don't think you want the government and an agency like mine becoming our nation's censor online. And that's what the executive order contemplates and asks us to start doing.
So then what is the role of these private companies in handling speech? Because obviously what they do has potentially major implications, as we can see with, protests and riots happening across the country, and the president continuing to post things that are inflaming the country.
Absolutely. Listen, they're ad-supported platforms, and they rely on our engagement. A lot of the ugly stuff moves really fast, and we need to have a national dialogue about what that means. But this executive order is not that. And turning my agency into the free speech police doesn't seem like the answer.
Do you think Twitter should label or remove tweets from Iran's leader? That is what Chairman Pai suggested in a tweet of his own on May 29th.
In the end, they're a private platform that gets to make choices about what they want to do online. And I hope they make good and smart choices that grow our democracy. But it's not up to government officials to tell private actors what to do. That's censorship. That's a problem that runs afoul of the First Amendment.
So you think Twitter is right, or right to make their call the way they've made it, and Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg right to make the call the way they've made it?
Well, they've got the opportunity to make choices under Section 230. That's the law today. They can remove or not remove whatever objectionable content they see fit, and they are responding to that law in different ways. My response is to the executive order, which is you don't want the Federal Communications Commission making those decisions for all of online speech. And the president's asking us to do so. That's not right. It doesn't work under the Constitution. And if we want to redo Section 230, there's a path to do that. You ask Congress to rewrite the law.
What's your take on the role of social media in these protests in the public discord? Because as you mentioned, these are incredibly influential platforms, and the choices they make have momentous, potentially, consequences.
Absolutely. I mean, historic consequences. I'm sitting here in Washington. It's in my backyard right now. And social media is where so many of us are getting our news. It's how we're organizing. It's how we're mobilizing. It's also how we're exposing what's wrong out there through videos we share. So it's very important. And it's challenging right now to figure out what the future of social media looks like. But I just don't think this executive order gets it right.
Meantime, the pandemic, the economic crisis has exposed a digital divide, the haves and have-nots, those who have access to the internet and those who don't. Talk to us about the steps that the FCC is taking to close that gap, and whether or not you think it's going smoothly.
Yeah, this pandemic has exposed a really hard truth, which is that our nation's digital divide is big. I mean, we've got millions of students who can't go to class because they can't get online. We've got folks who can't continue with their jobs because they don't have internet access. We've got parking lot Wi-Fi in this country right now because people don't have access at home, and they sit in their cars to go online and connect to school, to education, to healthcare. We've got to fix our nation's digital divide, and I think the FCC has a lot of work to do to make that happen.
So the FCC is reassigning airwaves for 5G service. How smoothly is that process going, and is it the right path?
Yeah, well, the United States led in the deployment of 4G, and the rest of the world took note of how the applications economy and the internet economy grew up here. And so there's a worldwide rush to do well in 5G. And candidly, I think this administration's been a little slow out of the gate. We don't have an all-government approach to 5G, and we've made some slow choices on spectrum policy, infrastructure deployment, and I think they're going to be challenging for us in the days ahead. I still think we can do a good job, but we've got our work cut out for us.
So what are the consequences of that going to be, the slowness out of the gate?
Well, it's hard to tell right now with the ongoing pandemic. I mean, we've slowed down spectrum auctions. There are standards that have been slowed down and deployments that have slowed down. But the future is going to be more connected. And the more things we connect to 5G, the more opportunities we're going to have in healthcare and education and entertainment, virtual reality, autonomous cars, so many things. And so the broader we can make those connections, I think the more we'll see our economy grow.
The FCC is voting Tuesday to speed up the process for companies to get local approval for placing 5G antennas. Where do you stand on this?
You know, what strikes me most is a lot of municipalities are concerned that this takes away their authority. So here we are in the middle of a pandemic when we've got these crises in the street and public health care problems. And in Washington, we're taking away the authority of a whole bunch of cities and towns to decide where deployment goes in their backyards and on their streets. I think in the end, we get more deployment if we figure out a way to work between the federal and local authorities. I'm afraid we're not headed down that path. And rather than speeding our nation's 5G deployment, it might just slow it down.
Now, we are headed down the path towards a potentially very contentious election, a critical election, and we can expect that obviously social media is going to play a role. The president is going to be very vocal, and these companies are going to have to make some tough and complicated calls. What do you say to the folks that these platforms, Twitter in this case in particular, is censoring free speech?
You know, I think that's the most ominous part of this executive order. It's not the actions my agency might or might not take. It's the fact from merely putting it out there, it's kind of a threat. I mean, it could deter those companies and the decisions they make about what misinformation they move offline or what objectionable content they choose to take down. Because the words of that executive order are sitting there in the background, and it's kind of a threat to their free speech choices. And it increases the capacity for them to self-censor in order to serve the president and the executive order. And I think that's the greatest chilling effect of what was put out last week. And I think it's worrisome.
So in a way, you think it's actually undermining the Constitution, that it is unconstitutional?
I think it's fraught with constitutional problems. I think a court will eventually tell us that. But in the interim, I think it does chill speech because it makes it a little harder to make decisions without recognizing that you might have the president's wrath if you take down objectionable content or violent content under Section 230.
And obviously that's important, especially, and I know this is outside your purview, but given multiple antitrust investigations happening into big tech companies, and you wonder if some of the decisions are actually being motivated by the hope of avoiding action from other agencies.
Yeah, I mean, that's just like you said, it's outside of my jurisdiction, but I think you're totally right to raise those issues. I think they're important to think about.
Jessica Rosenworcel, FCC Commissioner there. Meantime, we do have some breaking news. The U.S. Department of Justice has subpoenaed the 4 biggest meat packers in the United States in an antitrust probe. Speaking of antitrust, the DOJ demanding more information from these companies which dominate the U.S. meatpacking industry. The pandemic, of course, has revealed just how consolidated this industry is. As we know, several workers at meatpacking plants were sick. That created several bottlenecks that impacted the supply chain. You may have noticed your store shelves kind of empty if you were trying to buy meat, which raised this issue. And now the DOJ subpoenaing these meat packers following criminal indictments on Wednesday of 4 executives involved in chicken processing companies. So an expanding investigation here, and something that we are going to continue to follow as the U.S. continues to grapple with this meat crisis. Meantime, coming up, True Optics CEO Andre Swanston has been on our show many, many times. We talked to him about something different this time. He will share what it's like to be a Black CEO in America. That is next. This is Bloomberg. As protests continue to ripple across the country, TrueOptic CEO Andre Swanston, a frequent guest on our show, joined us to share a different side of his story, what it is like to be a Black CEO in America. I spoke to him earlier about the social crisis and what all of us can do.
I think for a lot of people, what I've heard from colleagues, from employees, investors, and others, it seems somewhat surreal. I think a lot of people are shocked by the events, the murder of George Floyd, and just, you know, it just seems like every week there's something. I think the thing that's saddening or most frustrating for me is that it's not that shocking. It's not that surreal. It doesn't seem any different than the norm that I've, you know, kind of the reality that I've known and people that look like me have known pretty much our entire life. You kind of learn these things and these expectations when you're a kid. It's almost, it's like growing up, the conversations that you have with your parents about how to interact with police officers is akin to like the birds and the bees conversation. It's one of those adolescent growing up things that everybody has to have.
You're normally here to talk about the media industry, but you wrote a really moving post about the experiences you've had with police multiple times, starting from when you were 17 years old, dragged out of your car as recently as a few years ago when you were CEO of TrueOptic. I'd love for you to expand on those experiences with us so we can all get a better idea about just what it really means to be Black in America.
Yeah, you know, I think, you know, what I've felt over the last week is I think a greater sense of empathy coming from all people. And, you know, it doesn't matter age or race. I think it's been, I think, just horrifying for people to see pretty much somebody get, you know, the modern day lynching or strangled to death by a police officer right in front of us. And I think for me, you know, I have not by any means had the worst experience or interactions compared to people that I know personally and the things that you hear on the news. But I think the thing that is important for people to know is just how frequent these things are. You know, you hear the once every few months about the horrific killing, and I think sometimes are numb to it, but it's really a daily, weekly, yearly, decade after decade thing that's happened. You know, I remember instances as young as 4 or 5 years old with my dad being stopped for not stopping at a stop sign that I know he stopped at. I was in the car, or you know, the condescending questions: whose car is this? And always having to justify, even when you do have wealth or success. You know, I myself have been, you know, handcuffed or been beat, you know, had a gun pointed at me by police 4 times in my life. Yet have never been charged with a crime or even arrested. And so, you know, it's just kind of this perpetual thing that it becomes, you know, what I said in my letter to our shareholders and to our employees. It just becomes emotionally exhausting to think about. And I think that's what's coming out for everybody across the country is just, you know, being fed up.
Meantime, there is the everyday. I mean, what is it like being a Black CEO in America and a Black CEO in your industry?
Yeah, I mean, look, you get used to often being the only one in the room, right? Or one of few, and that's almost you know, that's almost normal. I wouldn't say almost normal, it is normal. But that's not indifferent from your experience with going to prep school in Manhattan, right? Or going to boarding school in Connecticut, or being a young executive at JP Morgan Chase. So this isn't different, right? So it's kind of an environment or something that you're used to. I think, you know, what the other expectation that you have is, I think, you know, from talking with other peers, other Black CEOs and execs, is I think there's a different expectation that we have of ourselves, right? You almost always feel like your successes or your failures are indicative of the entire, you know, race, right? So I think about the capital that we've raised from venture capital firms and all the Fortune 500 clients that we have. And, you know, sometimes I think, you know, if I do well, this is and I can be successful, this is opening the door for more opportunity for others. But at the same time, I'm very cognizant that very few people have had the opportunity. And if I don't do well, it would be even more difficult for others. And I just don't know that that's a daily thing that other people that don't look like me maybe are as cognizant of. We all have pressures and expectations and motivations and stuff. So I'm not dismissing of the ones that other people have, because I think they're just as valid. I'm just more articulating the uniqueness of my experience.
Now, it is not incumbent on Black people to lead the change, but it is so helpful to hear from you about what the rest of us, companies, brands, can do. And so I'm curious what your take is. We're seeing companies put out statements, they're giving money to various organizations, they're going dark. Is that enough?
Nothing is enough if things haven't improved, right? So there's been lots of things that people have done over the years or the decades to make incremental change. In many instances, I would argue that we've taken a step back over the last 5 years, particularly under the current administration, and with a real indifference, I think, to social justice issues, not just for racial. It could be for xenophobia. It could be many other issues. I think what companies need to be careful of is coming off as opportunist or not seeming unique and genuine in the stances that they take, because then it could actually misfire or backfire. I think generally speaking, it is a positive thing that there's more public communication and more people seem to be addressing the issue. So I think that is definitely positive. One of the things that I think caught me the most over the last couple of days was with Viacom CBS and going dark across many of their networks on actual live TV for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. So there's definitely been some powerful things, but I think it just should be genuine at the very least.
True Optics CEO Andre Swanston there. So grateful that he shared all of that with us. Coming up, happy birthday, Mr. President. The Trump campaign spending $1.5 million on Google ads just last week. Advertising what exactly? We'll discuss next. President Trump's campaign spending a record $1.5 million on Google ads just last week. Many of the ads taking the form of a digital birthday card that supporters can sign ahead of the president's 74th birthday. I want to bring in Bloomberg's Eric Newcomer, who covers tech and politics for Bloomberg. So why the spike now, Eric?
I think even as the world sort of is going crazy, I think the Trump campaign must understand that this election is still coming. And, political campaigns for a while now, I think Obama did the same, have raised money off their candidates' birthdays. You can get people to sort of sign a birthday card, and then all of a sudden you have their information, and, you have a pathway to try and get them to donate to the campaign. So Google and Facebook have been super effective platforms for candidates and Trump, particularly to raise money from their supporters, even as, there are protests all over the country and we're in lockdown.
How is what Trump is spending compared to what Biden is spending?
Right now, Trump, at least on sort of Facebook and Google, is spending more. Biden obviously had to compete in a contentious primary. So if you look at his peak on Google spending, it came around Super Tuesday when he was trying to make sure he won against Bernie Sanders. So it seems like Trump sort of has an advantage here to pour a bunch of money. Now, partially raising money, but then there's also sort of the types of ads, sort of campaign ads that are trying to get voters to actually vote for you, not just donate. So Trump's doing both here. So there's a bit of an advantage. I mean, the picture can be a little bit more muddled because there are all these super PACs. Biden has, like Priorities USA putting in money, Acronym, other groups. So you see sort of Democratic aligned ads running even when it's not from the Biden campaign. But the Trump campaign is going still very aggressively on Facebook and Google.
Interesting. Well, we'll be watching to see how this shakes out as we get closer and closer to the election. Again, Trump spending a record amount on ads just in the last week on Google. Bloomberg's Eric Newcomer, thank you so much for that update. And that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang. Bloomberg Daybreak Australia is next. This is Bloomberg.